Good morning. Thank you for being here. We're a little bit late getting started, but hope that you will enjoy today's massive program of events. Very first thing, I'd like to invite Dr. Danica Miller, assistant professor here at UW-Tacoma, to give us a welcome on behalf of the Puyallup Nation.
Hashlachil tzitzi Danica Sterud Miller tzitsta Puyallup Ched. Welcome, honorable guests. I'm Danica Sterud Miller. I'm a citizen of the Puyallup Nation, and welcome to Puyallup territory. This is the Puyallup have always been known and are still known as the welcoming people. Our territory is here, but it also stretches all the way out to Tacoma, which is our word for Mount Rainier. So it's quite a large territory. But what's important for me to talk about today, just for a minute or two, is that for this area right here where we are right now, obviously Tacoma is an urban center. But what's, I think, really we don't talk about enough is that Tacoma's actually always been an urban center. This has always been a meeting place. So when people from other indigenous nations would come on down in their canoes or be walking around, they knew that they could come here and be welcomed. The Puyallup, our saying is that when the tide is out, the table is set, because we gather all the different oysters and clams and have a seat, grab a plate. So when I think what it means to honor the indigeneity of this land, and what it means for us in this room today, that means to continue to be welcoming to everyone who comes here, to listen to their stories, to sit down, have them grab a plate, and to honor that newness and that change and the stories that they bring. And I'm really glad to see everyone here today who is still participating in the Puyallup indigeneity of this land, which means to continue to be welcoming and to continue to share the beautiful wealth that this land that we're on today brings.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller. It is such a privilege to have a member of the Puyallup tribe as one of our professors. We're so proud to have her on our faculty and to be able to officially welcome you to the Puyallup Nation. It kind of makes my job secondary to welcome you to our campus, which is on their nation. But I hope, Professor Miller, that the University of Washington Tacoma, we honor what your people brought to this land and would still bring to this land. If you look at the back wall, you can see our strategic plan, and it's important for us as a campus to provide that welcoming nature, to provide equity for everybody that comes to our campus, to work with our communities, including the Puyallup tribe. So thank you very much for that welcome. So my name is Mark Pagano. I am the chancellor of this campus, and I always say my favorite job, part of this job, is to welcome people to our campus. So thank you for being here this morning. How many of you are from our campus? Some of you are students. Yeah, I recognize a lot of you around the room are our faculty or staff. But for the and you're welcome too. But for the rest of you, especially, welcome to our campus. I'm very excited about this event. I know several of these people on the stage here, and a couple of them at least have been, well, all of them have been hard at work, but a couple of them have been hard at work in the session, and we feel extremely privileged about the results of that session here at UW-Tacoma. We are going to have some new programs moving forward as a result of the hard work of our legislators here in Washington. So I just want to also tell you how proud I am of our students. Our students put all of this together. We have our Pre-Law Society, who was one of the main sponsors of this event. I know there's other sponsors here, our Office of Equity and Inclusion. I can see James, who runs that office out in the crowd as well. So our students work really hard at providing these forums on our campus to do something really difficult. This is difficult to come and talk about these issues that are controversial and to be able to express your passionate opinion about these things and hear other folks who might have different opinions about it. That is difficult work, and our students are leading in doing that on the campus's behalf. This is a great conference today, a great panel talking about issues that are so critical and so important, not only for our time now and our place right now, but across the entire world and across all time. We got to get this right. We have to get it right. Our country was founded on being an open place for immigrants to come and be successful and have a life full of joy and freedom. I am unfortunately not an immigrant, but my grandfather was. He came from Sicily in 1910, and this country provided him an opportunity. He pulled his money together and bought a taxi cab company, but then the Great Depression happened, and he had to sell that taxi cab company, but that kind of made him a little seed for the rest of his life. And then my dad was born, and I'm the chancellor of UW Tacoma, so it's a great place for opportunity. So welcome to our campus, welcome to this event, and thank you all for participating today. Next.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for coming here today. My name is Carla Vargas. I am the Vice President of the Pre-Law Society. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming here today and willing to learn, as well as be aware of the situations that are currently going on. I also wanted to let you know that yesterday for our legal clinic, it was really successful. We were able, in about 4 hours, we were able to serve around 36 families. And unfortunately, we were able to we had to turn away people, but we were really happy with what we got. And we hope that this conference and the legal clinic can continue for next year. So instead of 36 families, we're able to serve even 100 families. I also wanted to remind you today that we have to keep an open mind. We will be discussing today in our panels about different experiences people have faced. Not everybody is coming from Mexico. Not everybody is coming from Latin America. Everybody comes and migrates here from all over parts of the world, so we just wanted to make sure to highlight that. In addition, we wanted to remind you that no one is an illegal alien. That word was given to the undocumented community by the government. So please be aware, and when you go up to someone, make sure you use the word undocumented instead of illegal alien. And we also wanted you guys to make sure that when we approach someone, we're really sensitive and very aware of what we're saying to that person, because it can trigger some emotional feelings. In addition, we want to let you guys know that when we talk about a certain population, for example, the Latinx, we like to call them Latinx, not just Mexicans or Hispanics. We have some very some issues with that, so make sure that when you talk to someone that might say that they're from Mexico or might say they're from El Salvador, make sure to say that, remind yourself that it's the Latinx community. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Amora Lindsay. I am the Community Engagement Officer for the Pre-Law Society. And to start us off after those incredible welcomes, we are going to move right into talking to our legislatures and our judiciary, because what better way to tackle the problem than understand exactly how to work with it. So what I'd like to do is start with some introductions. Please feel free to tell us who you are and what work you've done that feels most relevant to this conference, if you will.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jeannie Darnielle. I'm state senator from here in the 27th District, and I've been in the legislature now for 19 years, and for every year of that time, I've served on the Human Services Committee, whatever the title has been, in the House and in the Senate, and currently chair the Human Services Reentry and Rehabilitation Committee. So that covers everything related to children, to the criminal justice system, post-crime, let's say. So when a person enters prison, that comes under my committee. All of juvenile justice and foster care and all those kinds of issues. I also serve on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the budget writing committee in the Senate. I'm on the Behavioral Health Committee, which deals with mental health and substance use disorder resources and programs. And I also serve on the Housing Stability and Homelessness Committee in the Senate. So I'm very happy to be here. It's amazing as you think about these topic areas, how they intersect with all of those committees and many more. So whether we're talking about labor and commerce or transportation or other kinds of ways that we serve people in the community, they all do intersect with this topic area of how we welcome and serve undocumented families.
Excellent. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Steve Gonzalez. I'm one of the 9 members of our state Supreme Court in Olympia. I started in my practice as a lawyer, and I did volunteer work with the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, representing people mostly in immigration, asylum matters. I was an assistant city attorney doing domestic violence work, where we had a policy not to share information with ICE because we want people to feel free to call 911 if they're the victim or reporting an incident and not worry that that will result in federal enforcement. It's a matter of the rule of law so that people can resolve their disputes peacefully and not extrajudicially. When I was a King County Superior Court judge before joining the Supreme Court, I helped pass a policy that prohibited the enforcement of ICE warrants at the courthouse. Those warrants, of course, are civil matters. People often mistake them for criminal matters, but an immigration warrant is a civil detention order, not a criminal matter. On the Supreme Court now, I chair the Interpreter Commission, among other duties, working to make sure that everyone who needs that help with language in court has that available. We've also written to Homeland Security asking them to designate courtrooms, courthouses as sensitive areas where they won't enforce immigration rules. Unlike the past 2 administrations, the current administration has declined to honor that request.
Thank you.
Good morning. I guess, yeah, it is still morning. My name is Claire Wilson, and I am 110 days in as your newest state senator here on the panel today for the 30th Legislative District, which is South King County, so Federal Way, Auburn, Des Moines, Fife, Algona, Milton area. I am also the first lesbian that is sitting as a state senator in Washington State, and I'm very proud about that. And I say that especially as we're here today, because I understand I walk with privilege, and I use that privilege every day. I have an opportunity to walk in a room and decide when and if I share who I am and what I stand for, and there are many in this room that don't have that same opportunity. My job is not to create or be a voice for others, but create a space so others can sit beside me, and then when I'm gone, can take my seat. So I'm humbled and I'm very proud, and also very grateful and thankful to have an opportunity to be here today. I started my career here in Tacoma, as a matter of fact, and I taught at Mount Tahoma High School. I had the teen parent program for 10 years, so I had 11 to 21-year-old pregnant and parenting teens, and have always worked in the context of families. After Tacoma, I worked for 25 years as executive director of our Head Start and our ECAP programs, our state and our federally funded pre-K programs for King and Pierce County, where I worked with tribal nations, county governments, school districts, private nonprofits, county governments, anyone and everyone that knew that children and families need help and support. And we're probably one of the very few countries that families almost have to do the wrong thing to get what they need to do it right. I am very much, also spent 8 years as a school board director in Federal Way, and just a month ago have resigned that position in order to focus on my Senate seat. But in that, also understand issues around access, opportunity, and voice, and looking at not only our issues around restorative practices and our school-to-prison pipeline, but also how we're engaging and involving families who come to us with different life experiences. And I know we'll have an opportunity to say more again. I'm just really pleased to be here today, and thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Lori Jenkins. I serve in the House of Representatives, and I represent this district along with Jeannie, so she's in the Senate, and I'm one of your 2 House members along with Jake Fye. And I was a little bit late in coming in because I just walked down from my other job, which is at the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department up the hill. So I'm trying to get my exercise in today. In terms of the legislature, I just finished my 9th year in the legislature. I chair the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee, which hears a lot of legislation related to immigrants, and probably the most important thing that we did this year was passing the Keep Washington Working Act, which was really, it made me quite joyful to work on that. I'm a lawyer by training, so I especially appreciate the pre-law program hosting this, and was a big pusher for the funding for the pre-law program here at UWT. So we're going to hope to keep on pushing that forward. I also serve on the House Healthcare Committee and have since I arrived, and so healthcare issues are quite important, especially as that relates to immigrant and undocumented folks. So we can talk a little bit about that today if folks want. And like Jeannie, who serves on the Ways and Means Committee in the Senate, I serve on the Appropriations Committee in the House, which is the budget writing committee in the House of Representatives. So super happy to be here with these 3 other really wonderful people. So I'll just be excited to get going.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank all of you for being here and lending us your expertise. It is fantastic. This is sponsored by both the Pre-Law Society as well as the Legal Pathways Initiative, which was gifted to us last year by the legislature, so thank you both for that. So to start with the first question, I think I'm going to direct it to Justice Gonzalez and then move into the legislatures. We recognize that immigration is largely a federal issue, but we are curious as to what can and is being done at the state level to serve both the documented and the undocumented communities.
Well, there's a great deal of intersection, even though it is a federal legal question. The immigration hearings are all in federal court. It's an administrative procedure. You don't have the right to counsel or the right to meaningful appellate review much of the time. But in state court, we do have something to say about what happens, and that's why we passed the policy before in King County Superior Court that we wouldn't allow ICE to pursue their warrants at the courthouse, which at the time the executive and the county council agreed to, and Homeland Security agreed to as well at the time, recognizing the importance of it. Law enforcement was on our side as well, because they also want people to trust them and call them when they need them and not be afraid that they're a representative of immigration enforcement. The other thing that we have done is pass a court rule in 2017 saying that your immigration status is not admissible in a civil dispute, that it's more prejudicial than it is probative, which means essentially you can't introduce it without making a good case to the court about why it needs to come in a given case, because we found that it was being used as leverage inappropriately in lawsuits, saying if you don't agree to settle for a small amount or dismiss your case, we'll report you to immigration. That is unethical now under the rule that we passed to try to make sure, again, that those lawsuits can be resolved on the merits rather than through extortion, which is really what that is. We continue to urge Homeland Security to treat courthouses as sensitive areas. Our Chief Justice Fairhurst has written to Homeland Security asking them to respect that request as well, and we'll be having follow-up meetings. I'm not terribly hopeful that this administration will budge on that issue, unfortunately.
Thank you for that.
Can I just, the state legislature has passed a lot of both budget and policy items over the last decade or so, even longer than that, related to undocumented folks. So I just kind of want to highlight a few of those when it comes to higher education. Since 2003, we've provided undocumented youth in-state tuition, and then in 2014, we passed the Washington State DREAM Act, which gave everybody access to the state need grant. And then the bill that we just passed this year is going to kind of broadly provide, fully fund and expand the state need grant so that everyone within certain income levels has access to higher ed. And many people will get that free. And that's really about our state constitution saying that we have an obligation as a state to educate every single child in this state up through grade 12. But I think we as a legislature have decided that we really want to go beyond that, so have tried to do that. In terms of healthcare, we have 30,000 undocumented children who are covered by the Apple Health program in Washington State. All undocumented women who are pregnant get prenatal care in Washington, and that's state funded. We had a dicey, kind of challenging time with reproductive health services this year and passed a bill in the legislature and then put in the budget rather than in the bill services for undocumented families in terms of reproductive health. And then I don't know how many people knew or paid attention, but last year we had a big challenge with our Department of Licensing releasing information to the federal government, and we've created some pretty strong data privacy requirements around that. And then, we can go into more detail on it, but the Keep Washington Working bill this year was really awesome, as well as we provided $1 million in funding to provide legal services for folks who have immigration issues in Washington State, and then also provided a fair amount of funding for the 2020 census to make sure that everyone gets counted. So those are just all things that we've done over the last few years as a legislature to try and address the needs of folks who are undocumented in our community.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
I did want to put a little context around this because I think it's important for you to recognize that we have, it may be no surprise, but we have really no bipartisan support for most of the initiatives that we have passed at the legislative level. And we as Democrats, almost to the extent that we don't even recognize how important it is, the things that we're putting into legislation, but we try to embed our values in our legislation. And it's not to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, but it's not to create a beacon of light, a lightning bolt that will cause the partisan divide to fracture the institution of the legislature and to ultimately result in bills not being passed. And so you'll find that in the 11th hour, when you've got a minority party and a majority party, that they will find things to fight about. You know, it's the nature of the legislative process. And I can't tell you how many times that 11th hour kind of fight has to do with undocumented persons in our society and how the state is on the hook, or how the state is giving away, or how the state is giving preference to people living in this community with an undocumented status. So I wanted to just say that while President Pagano wanted us to get this right as we proceed, I have spent a couple days home now from the legislature, and already I've had the opportunity to be reminded that we didn't start this nation doing much else than Native genocide. We didn't start this nation, we didn't build this nation without expelling the Chinese from our communities. We didn't fight our wars without finding enemies within and interning all the Japanese people on the West Coast. And we didn't start our census in 1790 counting black people as whole people, they were only 3/5 of a person. So we haven't done much right. We haven't done much right in our history. In fact, probably nothing when it comes to addressing our immigrant status. And you'll find even in the history of Tacoma, the land you're on, the land to our left, your left, my right, was Japantown, was Chinatown. These areas of Tacoma don't exist anymore, but if you look at the original census, you will find that in fact there are many, many names that you would typically address as being Chinese or Japanese rooted names. And so we don't have much common good experience. Our society is built on of someone being better than someone else, and we've been very much too creative in deciding who is less than me, who's less than you, and who wins and who loses. But I'll give you one example. We had a bill dealing with about this embedding these issues in legislation. We had an issue about giving identification cards to people leaving the justice system, our prisons, to help them re-enter society. And before that bill could get passed, and it didn't pass the first year because it got, what's that when we say something gets on the iceberg and teeters? There's a phrase for it. But anyway, it stuck in that spot because we refused to say that we could not provide identification cards for persons who were undocumented who were coming out of our prisons. So those are the kinds of ways that you don't intentionally move into a piece of legislation saying, yay, I'm going to hide this in here, or let's just not mention it, because if we mention it, then we're going to create this firestorm. But in fact, we do that a lot. And every time we do create a bill, like the Keep Washington Working bill was a good example this session. The whole purpose of that bill was to address the fact that nearly 1 million people in Washington state are immigrants. They make up 16% of our workforce, and that includes undocumented persons, 16% of our workforce. And so our economy as a state depends on these kinds of international connections, and we certainly don't want people who come here to work in our industries in Washington to live in substandard housing. We don't want them to be unsafe vis-a-vis their personal safety. But this bill will require state agencies to provide services without regard to a person's citizenship or immigration status. And it also limits that information. It was previously mentioned about how we share information about, well, we won't after this law. We won't share information in any state agency. So to the maximum extent that we can still meet federal law, we will do so. But it's really a landmark piece of legislation, prime sponsored by Senator Lisa Wellman, and the Senate bill was 5497. Really gives us a good pathway to implementing those kinds of policies across our state. But I hope we do get it right, but we are hamstrung by our ability to do that when the right gets a hold of the topic and they are, they hang on to it. They really create the kind of division that stops us in our tracks for a lot of progressive policy in our state. But this particular piece of legislation was really tremendous to pass this session.
Excellent, thank you for that.
I'm just going to speak as the new senator who has come in and one of 6 that we kind of consider ourselves a little bit of disruptors in the system.
They're great.
And never been through a session before. And there are politics, and then there are the politics. And I think the beauty of this we're not considering ourselves freshmen, we're first year. And I think one of the things we decided we wanted to do was smash the patriarchy, so we got rid of that word. But we've also spoken words on this floor that have never been spoken in the Senate before, like queer and like lesbian and like words that mean something and words that say that we understand the complexities and also the struggles that individuals have. I know in our work, we will not be stopped by the conversations that sometimes keep things from moving forward, and sometimes it's because we don't know that we're supposed to. You may read about I-1000, which was probably the most historical vote that has been taken this session, and one, for me, of the most powerful votes that was taken this session, and also probably one of the most frightening votes that was taken this session as we look at the response from individuals in the gallery. You know, my mom came here, and Kristallnacht was her most vivid childhood memory, and she came here as an illegal alien because there was no such thing as being undocumented, and came and lived in a settlement home, a house with her family, and they lost everything in Germany, and but I never really knew her story. And as I was an adult, we all got together and asked my mom 25 questions one day, which allowed her to start kind of telling us her story. And I think as I talked to the pre-law group the other day, I think critically important are stories. And I know that they're incredible. They're also, there's great fear in telling stories. And so we haven't done it right. And we've expected those with those stories to stand up and to speak up and speak out while they're not safe speaking up and speaking out. And so part of, I think, my work and my world has been not to call myself an ally, but to be called an ally, and to be a voice and to speak up and out, especially as I see those wrongs continue. And living in my community, when I see youth stand up and be the voice, I am so apologetic that as an adult we haven't done it right, and we haven't done what's best for our young people. I have a 19 and a 21-year-old who I care deeply about, and they have lots of friends, and they are who is going to take on all of the issues that we've left behind. My work has been to provide a safe space, so there's room for DACA students, and creating safe space and support for FAFSA, so families and children know that they have opportunity. Been a reference for law school, for access scholarships, you know, being a voice in a space and a person. If each one reaches one, then we can, you know, make a change. And being so young and so new in the Senate, we don't know what we can't do. All we know is what we need to do. Mm. And the other thing is the change comes from not the inside, but from the outside. I sit as vice chair of K-12 Early Learning. I sit on the Human Services Rehab and Reentry with Senator Darnell, which I'm just absolutely thrilled about. And I also sit on transportation, which is a major issue as we think about populations, and we think about concerns, and we think about access. And so I look forward to really looking to you to say, what is it that's going to change? And what do we need to do from the inside to make those changes happen? And then being able to stand up and speak on behalf and again, create space and also create changes in legislation and laws, because I awaken every day and I worry federally what happens. But I know we have folks like Justice Gonzalez and others, and we have senators and representatives like ourselves that will protect as much as we can protect around the state of Washington, and that right now is the most important thing that I can do, and then create the pathway for those who will come after me to continue to maintain those safe spaces so that hopefully we will change the trajectory for the young people. So anyway, thanks.
Wonderful, thank you.
May I chime in with
Of course.
two quotes that I wasn't planning on mentioning today, but have been triggered as I hear the remarks so far. My position is nonpartisan, so as a judge, I have no party affiliation, and so let me first start by speaking bluntly and saying neither party is blameless in the condition of our immigration situation. in this nation. We have had administrations from both parties who have failed nationally to fix the issue and use it as a wedge issue. So I'll just be blunt about that. We also have had times in the past where laws have been passed in the state as well that have sacrificed immigrant communities, excluded them from wage and hour protection or housing standards. And even though those standards might be good things in general, we have sacrificed members of our society in the name of compromise and furthering those laws. I am glad that the people I'm sitting with here today don't have that tendency. So I don't mean to besmirch them, but I do want to say that it's not just a one side is right and the other side is wrong debate. We all have a responsibility to fix these issues. In my own county, I live in the capital, which is Thurston County. It's named after Sam Thurston. I want to read first a quote from Sam Thurston. It used to be at the time of his life that this area was not a state yet. It was the Oregon Territory, and what is now Washington used to be part of the Oregon Territory. And here's what he said. It's a question of life or death to us in Oregon. The Negroes associate with the Indians and intermarry. And if their free ingress is encouraged or allowed, there would a relationship spring up between them and the different tribes, and a mixed race would ensue inimical to the whites. And the Indians, being led on by the Negro, who's better acquainted with the customs, language, and manners of the whites than the Indian, these savages would become much more formidable than they otherwise would, and long bloody wars would be the fruits of the commingling of the races. It is the principle of self-preservation that justifies the actions of the Oregon legislature, which excluded blacks from coming to the Oregon Territory. Yet we name our capital county after this man. The other quote that I wanted to mention is from Lincoln. Now, Lincoln said some vile things about blacks as well, but the quote that I'm going to read to you is not about that. It's about immigration and expansion in the context of slavery, because he was running for the Senate in Illinois at the time, 1858, and his opponent, a judge, Judge Douglas, and he were debating. And what they were debating about is whether in the new territories that became states, there should or shouldn't be slavery. Judge Douglas was in favor of having the new territories themselves vote on whether there would be. And here's what Lincoln said in response to that. My opponent would leave the question of slavery where the territory was acquired to be settled by the people of the acquired territory. If Judge Douglas's policy upon this question succeeds and gets fairly settled down until all opposition is crushed, the next thing we'll do is grab for the territory of Mexico. When we shall get Mexico, I don't know whether the judge will be in favor of the Mexican people that we get with it, settling that question for themselves and all others, because we know the judge has a great horror for mongrels. And I understand that the people of Mexico are most decidedly a race of mongrels. This is Lincoln speaking. He went on to say, I understand that there's not more than one person out of 8 in Mexico who's pure white. And I suppose from the judge's declaration that when we get Mexico, or any considerable portion of it, he'll be in favor of these mongrels settling the question. Lincoln is not my hero. He uttered those words during that debate, and as we know, Honest Abe didn't lie. That was his view of my ancestors from Mexico. I think it's important that we recognize that, as you've alluded to, our founding fathers weren't pure. They talked about freedom, but it was freedom for themselves. And I appreciate the president's remarks about how welcoming this country is, but that's not my experience with it. I think we have a history of excluding people based on religion and race. And the only time we have opened our arms and welcomed brown people into this nation was because we were more afraid of red than brown. We allowed in Cubans and Vietnamese, but only because of our fear of communism, which overtook our fear of brown people.
Thank you for that. One of the things that was mentioned was stories and lived experiences. I very much encourage all of you, as well as the audience members, to come around in the evening. We will be having a panel of student lived experiences, which includes some, all who have some relationship to immigration, some of which are undocumented. The next question actually relates to one of the comments that you mentioned is with partisanship, so relates to our populations. So what can we as citizens do, both in relation to the legislature and just in relation to being a part of a community, to help both the documented and the undocumented populations in Washington? Anyone, feel free.
I mean, I'm happy to start. I guess one of the things I didn't mention in terms of my background is that I'm the former chair of the Tacoma Community House Board and sat on that board for a long time. So immigrant rights have been kind of a focus of a lot of my career work. And I think this connects in some part. I'm sure everybody's going to have some suggestions, but it connects in some parts to what we were talking about, how scary it is to be undocumented or to be an immigrant and to out yourself as that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like Claire, I have a similar experience. I was the first out lesbian elected to the state legislature. And, you know, every day, Claire talked about the benefits of that, like, because I can either be out or not out. And that choice comes with a great deal of pressure, just like it does, or very similar, I should say, to the pressure that it feels like to be undocumented or to be an immigrant, having to make that choice time after time about your safety, and then also to think about the fact that much of society places their whole experience on, if you're somebody in this room right now who's an immigrant or who's undocumented, people will say, well, I met someone who, and then they will place all their experience of a whole population on you. That is incredibly heavy, heavy, heavy. So, but I think that for me, if I'm going to be a good ally, I have to speak when others can't speak. I have to tell stories when others can't tell stories. My last legislative assistant was undocumented, and she really lived in fear. She has 3 younger siblings. She really lived in fear that her parents were going to be, sent away, and they had serious conversations in their family about whether or not how she would keep her 3 younger brothers. She was 21 years old. And so my ability to try and have some understanding of what her experience was and to talk to people about that experience, so she wasn't always forced to tell her story, but to try and tell it in a respectful way, is, I think, a very important thing for allies to do. I also, though, think it's, to me, in terms of being a good ally, it was always really important for me to check in and say, what is it you need me to do? Because I think a lot of times allies will go off, and I've done this before myself, go off and do what I've decided as the white woman is the best thing to be done. And it really turns out that the community that I'm trying to represent and help does not feel like that's the best or most hopeful thing to be done. So I think maintaining that balance about, really hearing what would be helpful and then doing the things that would be helpful, I think, are very important. And I'm sure there's going to be a ton of other suggestions.
Thank you very much.
I'll just say, in my work in early learning, for 25 years, I've worked with families, and in our early learning programs, we don't have a question about documentation status. So anyone who comes through and has small kids and has a need has the ability to be served by our program. And so I think for me, it is, again, creating that safe space and speaking up and speaking out, not on behalf of other people, but using my voice to speak about the truth and about what I know. It is very easy for people to say, well, just come tell us what you need. But people don't often understand, again, what that does as far as exposing yourself. Had a recent conversation at a city council meeting around transgender population. All they need to do is come just tell us. what they need. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And it's like anything else. When you're coming and you're coming up, you're coming out. And it's not always a safe place or a safe space to be in. So how is it that we become a voice and become the ally, and also have those places where we don't assume we know, and we don't assume we know what's best, but we create a space for a voice. And I'll just say, looking at my last election, my greatest supporters didn't vote at all. But what they did do was know that I cared deeply about who they were and how they walked this world and the inequities that existed, and created a place for them to use their voice in support of. And related to this conversation and the panel that's happening afterward, young people being afraid to use their voice, not because of fear for themselves, but for their families. And that's a huge issue for me as well, and how it is that we change that. So we hear the stories, because stories are the things that change people's emotion, and that changes their vote, and that changes outcomes. So I just, this is just who I am, and it's what I do, and it's what we need to continue to do for everyone across our state. I think the only other thing I would say that hasn't been brought up is the issue of language access, and that in my school district, we serve 120 languages. Across our state, we have so many more, and then you think about how we communicate and how we actually ask people for input and information, and we are very limited in how we're doing that. And so that's another area I think that we need to look at and that we need to change in order to change everything that we're talking about today.
Excellent, thank you.
Oh, well, so far you've heard me read quotes, so let me read a positive one instead of the two negative ones. This one's by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. It's not about supplication, it's about power. It's not about asking, it's about demanding. It's not about convincing those who are currently in power. It's about changing the very face of power itself. That's what I think it's about.
I think that's very succinct. Thank you. Currently, there are some cards going around for a controlled Q&A, so we will be getting some questions from the audience. The last formalized question relates to the Northwest Detention Center here in town. There are many people on this campus, as well as part of our community, who look to shutting it down because it's a blight on our society and our city. One of the challenges that's been brought to that is what then happens to the people who are being housed there. Do they get sent to a state that has less protections? Or, as is being reported by the Associated Press, perhaps Guantanamo Bay? So the question becomes, in what way can we serve the people in that center while still not supporting, condoning, or tolerating it? What can be done?
I wanted to mention a bill that did start in the legislature this year, and like many good policy bills, we don't get everything we want the first year.
I think you did.
Is it on now?
Yes.
I did. We don't always get every good piece of policy the first year it's proposed, but this was a bill proposed by Senator Guy Palumbo from Bothell, and he and I worked on the language of this bill having to do with what power does the state have to exclude or to bar the building of any private prisons in our state. We have a terrible overcrowding right now in our prison system, which of course has many undocumented persons in our prisons. We had a push during the previous governor's administration to actually put those undocumented persons on a plane and send them back to Mexico, because that was where the perception was, all of where they were all from. Of course, that's not true. But we do have planes that leave Boeing Field and do take people to other countries who are coming out of our prison settings. But it was actually addressed about whether or not we needed more prisons in Washington. We're at about 109% capacity right now in our prisons, which means that people are serving their time in jail settings where there's no programming, or they're bunking up more than the regular number of people in a room, or they're like the women at Purdy sleeping on mattresses in what were previously not called rooms or cells. So we do have some pressure on our system that's capacity-based, and there is a concern by the Department of Corrections that there will not be sufficient facilities in our state. So could we contract with a for-private company to build a prison here in Washington State? So the bill was attempting to preempt that kind of discussion by saying that we would not condone further private prisons being built in the state of Washington based on what we see right now across the waterway, which is a private prison run by Geo. Is it still Geo, or did they sell? Okay, Geo, and which is a company that runs state prisons in many of the states across the country. So that bill didn't pass this year, but we will come back with that in some form in the future to address that. But we should all be emboldened by, as mentioned, our voices being heard. And but there are ways that you can provide support to the families. There is a near constant, if not constant, presence of supporters outside of the detention center today. And while there may be people in the community that would advocate for some sort of more vocal, perhaps more violent kind of exercise of their free speech rights to confront the presence of that prison in our community. There are also many voices of love, many voices of concern, and I grew up on a college campus. I went on to get my master's degree in higher education administration, worked on campuses across up and down the West Coast prior to moving into nonprofit work, and politics. But I'll say that their voices can come from all angles, can be of all volumes, can have varying degrees of emotion, but I think there's so much we can do even when our voice is quiet, even when our voice is loving, to be able to help the families that are associated with the men in that prison, men and women.
I would just make two suggestions. One is to contact Northwest Immigrant Rights Project and see if there are ways to help, and the other is to work with One America on advocacy and organizing.
Excellent.
That was exactly, and I know a lot of folks who have been outside beating drums and being a loud voice at the detention center. And I think, again, I come at it from looking at kids and families and what we're doing as far as disruptions and how we're continuing to traumatize children and families as we, whether it's locking up parents or whatever. And in my early learning world, every day, still hear stories of moms or dads who left and then didn't come back. Mm-hmm. And we've got traumatized kids and trying to figure out how it is that we reunite families. So we may have something horrible, but I think the worst thing we can do is to move families even further away from each other. And we have to come up with a solution, and we have to figure out what that looks like and how that looks like. But we can't do that at the expense of traumatizing and ruining, hundreds of families. We've done that enough.
Excellent point.
My perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this question and the conflict that you present in the question, because I totally feel that conflict. I think that, this is a weird analogy, and I'll try and explain it, but it's similar to me on the work that I do on behavioral health. When we invest in services for folks who have mental illnesses or substance use disorder, I think a lot about what are we investing in just to make everybody else feel better versus what are we investing in to really help the people who have illness feel better. And I think a lot of our investments have historically been about institutionalization and making the rest of society feel better, not really about providing people treatment that they want. So I think about, like, part of me thinks, okay, right, we close down the detention center and it moves somewhere else. Great, we feel better. Is that better?
Right.
I don't think so. So then I think about, how do we leverage power to actually have real immigration reform in the U.S.? Because I think that's, any action we do around the detention center for me is about, honestly, kind of trying to drive home the need for real immigration reform. And that's not to say I don't do things. Like, I've done a fair amount of work on I've toured the detention center a number of times, trying to get asylum seekers no-cost medical appointments and things like that, linking people with NWERPs so that folks who are actually discharged might have a place to stay and things like that. So I think there are things to be done, but I guess I'm just expressing my angst, which is what your question was about, is the angst of this.
Exactly. And audience question that actually ties right onto that
wanted
is...
to finish
please,
by
please,
saying
go
one
ahead.
thing.
Please.
You're the pre-law society, and eventually we are going to have a law school here at the University of Washington, Tacoma. My stepson graduated from the main campus law school, and I'm really proud of him. He is an assistant attorney general, but he and his fellow workers have been addressing how they can, in their private volunteerism, focus their work on using their skill sets as lawyers to address the issues of asylum seekers. And I had the opportunity to live with my stepson during the session because lives in Thurston County, and helped me with my commute, which I hated. But what I was able to observe with him was the amount of time he spends in his personal hours addressing asylum seekers, and the great pride he feels in his fellow lawyers for working together really deep into the night and to try to find the angles to help individual families. And so in whatever ways that you go forward in your law degrees as you address public interest law kinds of positions in your future, let me just say that I know that these are not the positions that pay well. They are not the positions that result in you being able to pay off your student loans in a really quick amount of time. But they are the right side of law, the right side of taking your skills and really applying it to where your values are as human beings. And so I, many years ago, was able to establish at the main campus, and I'm really hopeful that you have it here as well as you launch, but a loan repayment plan for those students that undertake work in public interest law kinds of programs. So I wish you well, and I want you to really revel in the fact that you're going to have a skill set that other people are going to need, and you will have the power to help them. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you for that. So I have 4 questions from the audience that we will cover, and then we will, if no one has to run right away, we'll be able to get out of here. So the first one actually relates to what Representative Jenkins was saying. Do the state legislature and or the state Supreme Court have leverage to push federal immigration reform?
I mean, if you look at, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Keep Washington Working, the bill. So I don't know how aware of this people are, but this bill says that neither state nor local officials can enforce federal immigration law, which might seem like no big deal, but we have many local jails that have agreements with ICE that hold people until ICE get there to interview them and then to take them. This bill says you cannot do that any longer. It prohibits ICE from being interpreters for families in schools so that we don't have that fear happening. And it essentially is, the way I look at it is, right, we don't have our local or state law enforcement who enforces the IRS tax code, right? So this says treat immigration status like the tax code. We don't, as a state or local jurisdictions, enforce federal law. The feds do that. And I think that kind of work where we continue to place pressure and show that the way the federal government is operating does not work, and that we will not work in solidarity with that kind of completely unworkable system, I think helps. I think we can also, we pass resolutions from time to time, and I don't know, I'm sure we have done something related to this, but, we talk to members of Congress. We wrote a letter last year that a number of people signed to Congress on folks' immigration status and on the Trump rules around it. So we try and push in every way we can, and we try to not participate in the most awful pieces of our federal system. And so I think we can help. I don't think we can do it alone, and I think it takes a pretty comprehensive national movement to do this. But I think that we can do things.
Well, we've also been very fortunate to have a very aggressive Attorney General.
Yeah.
And how many suits now has he?
I think last time he said 31 suits, hasn't
31
lost a one yet.
31 suits against the federal government, and it really, what's Noah's last name? Purcell. Noah Purcell, one of the senior litigants with the Attorney General's office, was really at the center of that first big immigration bill with the stopping people from coming to this country if they were Muslim, So he's been really brave, I think, in moving the resources of the Attorney General's office very strongly into addressing those ways in which the federal law or the federal interpretation of power and law has affected people in our state. And so I really think Washington benefits a great deal from having an Attorney General that is so aggressive on these points, because it's a real backup to when we talk to our members of Congress, and then we see that our state is willing to pass laws like the Keep Washington Working Act, and to make sure that undocumented women can have their prenatal and childbirth costs covered in our state, that we're willing to step up with our budgets and our time and our commitment to serving these populations. And that then bolsters the positions of our members of Congress to support those same kinds of efforts when they see our state being a leader on confronting the Trump administration's policies.
The judicial branch does not have that leverage.
That sounds fair. So I've actually been corrected. We have had such a wonderful conversation that we only have time for one more question. So what I would ask is, actually, when we talk about policy, there is always backlash, positive and negative, no matter which action you put in. And I think better than anyone, this group of people understands that. So with that in mind, if you had the full support of the legislature, what approach to immigration would you push through?
Is this a dream or a reality? Because if it was a dream to me, it's if you're here and you'd like to be here, then there's a place for you here. And there's support for you here. And you are welcomed here as a member of our community of the state of Washington. And there would be nothing that would keep anyone out. For no one kept anyone before us out. And there's no reason why we should suddenly believe we have a key to a door. I think the value is in the diversity that we each bring, and that's, first people were here and that's how we were built, and to suddenly believe that a group of individuals or a group of people suddenly are privileged and can shut the world out is, I just can't, I don't know in my brain how people get there. And it's about fear, it's about pre-civil rights values around if I have something, then you can't, because there's not enough for both of us, that my knowledge is better and your knowledge is worse, and those just are the things that cause us to be where we're at today, as opposed to believing there's enough for everyone, and that's an and both world, not an either or world, and that we have my view of wealth as opposed to a view of scarcity. So my world would say there's room for all of us.
Boy, I echo that. I tend to look at things from the standpoint that we have more abundance and than we think we do, and we have such a fear of losing something that we tighten up our ability to access the abundance that we have. And in the pie in the sky kind of goal, I agree wholeheartedly that if anything, we're finding out how much we share, how much we agree on. And so if we were to take any child, I'll use this analogy, this was actually shared with me by an elder from the Colville tribe up in Northeast Washington. His name is Mel Tenasket. And Mel had worked for the state for many years. He's now in his 80s. He'd worked in mental health services and has become a tribal leader over those years, but has a real dedication to children. And he drew the picture for me one day about that we hold children's hands. I mean, we do that as protective parents, and loving adults. And his concept was that when we see a child who's been taken from their family because of abuse, or we see a child who's in our justice system, we have to recognize that someone let go of that hand. And things happen to children without their consent, And so certainly if you look at our national laws and you look at the ways that we exclude people from programs, this wasn't the fault of any child. And if we all had the commitment to children, then we, by extension, would have commitment to their families. And I think that in our perfect society, work of people like Claire in early childhood education and access for all children to education, especially all the way into the work you're doing in higher ed, is critical to building families and building a more homogeneous, helpful society. So that's a good story.
I guess I would say I would hope that Washington would never need to become a sanctuary state, because we have forced the federal government to really reform our immigration laws, to recognize that that immigration actually strengthens our nation rather than weakens it, and that we would do the things to strengthen our nation rather than try to create a permanent underclass by making certain people's presence here illegal, making them undocumented, and that's being done very intentionally, I believe, to keep a permanent underclass. Whereas we could, this is what Jeannie and Claire have both said, but we could raise every part of our society by really recognizing the strength that immigration brings us. And so at first I was thinking, well, we should be a sanctuary state, and I'm like, that's so limited. No, we shouldn't. No one should need to be a sanctuary state. So I guess I would, if I could do anything, I would make the Washington State Legislature all-powerful, and then make us be able to change federal law in this regard and create a much better national system than we have right now, and more national commitment.
So to rephrase it and close out, I would love to hear, I recognize that you are in the judiciary, but you have an experience that is very unique. And so what would you like to see happen in general for our approach to immigration?
I'll add two things to it. I would ask us to stop being hypocritical and using euphemisms. We call exclusion race and religion and immigration policy. We should just call it what it is, just as we called manifest destiny when really what we were talking about was genocide. I think language matters, and being honest with our language is important. And the second point I'll make is that due process matters. In the immigration system, we shouldn't say that you don't get a lawyer. We especially shouldn't say that children don't get lawyers when they have to appear. So I think due process matters, and it matters for everyone, regardless of your status.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate you. Thank you all for being here. And if we could all give them a round of applause.